So I think we've had a very good start to the session, and from Andrew's inspirational video and welcome to the group, to some good dialogue with the roundtables and some Q&A. So we have this next session will be focusing on actually a really very interesting process that took place last year, where the Minister of Sport commissioned a review called the 2010 and Beyond panel. What's happening in sport beyond the 2010 Olympic Games, as well as insight into Own the Podium and the future direction that will be taken with that organization. Joining us today and will be facilitating the session is Victor Lachance, the Executive Director of True Sport Foundation, who recently managed the Secretariat for the 2010 and Beyond panel, established by the federal government to look at the future of high-performance sport in Canada. Canada is also past Senior Leader of the Sport Matters Group and is Senior Advisor to the Canadian Centre for Ethics, Canadian Centre for Ethics Board of Directors. Victor also operates his own consulting company, Lachance and Associates, in Canada. Business cards will be available after the session. Anne Merklinger, an elite athlete for most of her life. Anne Merklinger was a member of Canada's national swim team from 1977 to 1981. She earned a silver medal at the 1979 World University Games in the 200-meter breaststroke. Is it correct? Right. Excellent. After a distinguished swimming career, Merklinger focused on curling, and since the early 1980s, she has competed with distinction at every major event she has entered. She is consistently ranked as one of Canada's foremost curlers, winning the Ontario Women's Curling Championship in 1993, 1994, 1998, and 2000. She has twice led her team to the final of the Scott Tournament of Hearts in 1998 and 2000. Anne has more than 20 years of management experience with national sport organizations, and is the former Director General of Canoe Kayak Canada. We have some canoe kayakers here in the crowd that you may recognize. And has worked for the Commission for Inclusion of Athletes with a Disability and the Canadian Federation of Sport Organizations for the Disabled, and is Director of Summer Sport for On the Podium. Karen O'Neill has extensive experience working in the not-for-profit and government sector for over 20 years. In addition, Karen has also pursued a consulting career where she focuses on the relationships between strategies and implementation for accelerated performance. She has held several senior sport positions over the past, including, take note of all of these, panel member for the 2010 and Beyond, Chief Operating Officer for the Rick Hansen Foundation, Chief Executive Officer of Commonwealth Games Canada, current board member of True Sport, and previous board member of Sport BC and CPC. So without further ado, I would invite Victor to lead us through this session.
All right, thanks, Eric. The intention of this session is really to engage you. It's to engage you in a process where at the end, hopefully, you'll have a better understanding, better knowledge of the 2010 panel report, of how OTP operates, and as we talk about the future of high performance, particularly as it affects you, the athletes. This gives you an opportunity to, in your own view, describe or identify, even maybe promote certain ideas, how you see or what you think is a better future for high performance athletes. And again, if the session works, it should equip you with ideas and information and some sense of direction for the kind of actions you may want to take, the kind of issues you may want to raise back in your sport organization or even within Athletes Can around high performance and the kind of contribution you can make to make it better. That was the purpose of the 2010 panel that you're going to hear about. That's what OTP tries to do, and I think a lot of people in this room would want to do the same thing, so hopefully this session will help you get there. Je suis certain qu'il y a des athlètes francophones parmi nous aujourd'hui. Bon, c'est clair que l'atelier va se dérouler principalement en anglais, mais en même temps, il ne faut pas se gêner s'il y a de quoi que vous n'avez pas compris, si vous voulez demander des questions en français, si vous voulez discuter en français, tout ce que vous voudrez. ça marche. On est là pour ça, puis on veut vous accommoder autant que possible. Donc, gênez-vous pas du tout. Puis, à un moment donné, comme je dis, on peut faire certain que tout est bien compris. So ideally, we'll have a lively exchange of views, and to get us going, we'll turn it right back to Eric and take it away.
So with the last fall, Athletes Can partnered with Coaches of Canada to provide a submission, really addressing, there were some specific questions, 4 or 5 key questions that were put forward to the broader sport community. And Athletes Can, in partnership with Coaches of Canada, put together a submission that addressed each one of those questions successively. You know, there was really a general support for LTAD and the recruitment of athletes from playground to podium recognition, which I think Athletes Can, yesterday, by virtue of the Kids Can Day, be involved in the community and engaging kids and active life in general. But more specifically, things that affected athletes at the high performance level, there were some very specific things that we supported on your behalf and on behalf with the coaches. One of those was to support the coaches and recognize that there's a lot, you know, that is a very key role in the leadership and support of the athletes, and making sure that we do have strong coaches in place, that they aren't being recruited away to other countries, such as we have seen in a few cases with coaches being offered opportunities in London, with leading up to London currently. So it was a very strong forging of that relationship and expression to the 2010 and beyond panel, that we as athletes also support our coaches. There was general support for the idea and the benefits that have been seen with the Canadian sports centers, and support programming as being a key differentiating factor in the performance that we're able to deliver on the field of play and in the development of our sports. Also recognizing, I think in general, you know, support for the idea of being able to train at centers where there are more than one sport, and interaction with other athletes, learnings from other athletes, which we're seeing being created currently in Montreal. There's the Stade Olympique. There's, I think, some very good successes there, and the athletes who are there, including our wonderful water polo athlete here, where that, you know, there is support for that, where it's possible to bring sports together to benefit from common services. There was also comment in our report and as well on the panel discussion. So part of the process was panel discussions in what were the cities we had? Ottawa, Montreal, and Calgary, where we had representation from Athletes Can here in Ottawa, as well with myself in Calgary. One of the things that we talked about was the retention of athletes, not just being necessary for funding, but integration with the universities and the opportunities to pursue an education while you're pursuing your high performance objectives, was a key point that we put forward. Access to funding, not only through Sport Canada, but through tax credits for sponsorship and sponsors, as being a way to access not just sponsorship for the Canadian Olympic Committee or the large events, but for the individual athletes to have support or a greater window of access of funding, and in that sponsorship was another key point that we put forward. So maybe I won't hold up any more time. Just wanted to really bring you up to speed on, you know, the key points of the report that we had brought forward, and the partnership with Coaches of Canada that we partnered in for that submission last year.
Thanks, Eric. Should I go? Good morning, everybody. Does that work? Great, thanks, Phil. My name's Karen O'Neill, and I was lucky enough to be one of the 5 panel members on the Minister's 2010 and Beyond. And as with Eric, what we're going to do is just provide some highlights of what the panel represented. In no way can I without probably about a week, go into the level of detail that I'd like to share in terms of some of the richness of the panel. So the intent is to provide a bit of an overview. As much as we focus on the report, the panel for myself, and I think many of those engaged, represented a number of things. In terms of the background, it was a really pivotal time in high-performance sport. It was about 14, 15 months ago. 2010 in Vancouver had not yet occurred, so that the thinking from sport leadership, and particularly what had captured the minister's attention at the time, was the need to look at a vision and goals and some concrete plans moving us into the future, so beyond 2010 in Vancouver, and thus the name of the panel. As much as we talk about the panel and the report, I would be remiss if I didn't really speak to what the process was, because for myself, and probably one of the items that I'm most grateful for in terms of my participation, was the opportunity to read the tremendous amount of the papers, the thinking that went into every single one of the presentations that were provided to the panel. Eric and Victor spoke about the 3 cities where there were round tables where, for better part of a full day, organizations across the country, of which Athletes Can was represented at all 3, Montreal, Ottawa, and Calgary, in addition to the paper that you co-authored with the Coaches Association. So for myself, as much as there's an output called a paper, it was about the dialogue. It was about the spark generated by each and every one of the sport leaders across the country and where that dialogue took us. And again, as much as we're going to focus on the panel report, if you've not had a chance to look at some of the original submissions, obviously your own, but many of the other rich submissions that, as much as both Victor and David Brooke, who had the unenviable task of distilling all of this material into a coherent package, but there really are some lovely pieces of both inspiration and leadership in the many submissions. So with that in mind, the minister pulled together a panel of 5 individuals. The chair was a gentleman by the name of David Zussman, who has an outstanding and allotted political career, in addition to currently being, I guess, the Dean of Management over at the University of Ottawa. So he understands public policy in the government, and he was established as the chair. Second individual on the committee was a fellow by the name of George Heller. Now, George Heller, many of you know if you've enjoyed some of the HBC clothing for portions of the Olympics or Commonwealth. And George was the previous CEO of the Hudson's Bay and Zellers, in addition to being the CEO of the 1994 Commonwealth Games in Victoria and the current president and chair of the Foundation for the Commonwealth Games. Chantal Petitclerc was the next member. Outstanding and decorated Paralympic track athlete and also leading advocate in the country. And then Cathy Priest Nur. Many of you would know Cathy through her role with VANOC. Before that was Salt City. And before that, again, outstanding track record as an athlete, as a speed skater, and myself. So with that, the minister established the panel. And as both Victor and Eric reported, it really was to respond to the question, how do we take this tremendous opportunity to look ahead and basically shape the kind of world that we want for sport in Canada? So what we heard was, in addition to an incredible amount of passion, was consistency. And I think that actually was a surprise to many of the panel members, because I think everybody here knows that certainly difference of opinion is not bad, but it's how do you collect that difference of opinion to create a unified whole or a vision. And in fact, that was probably one of the easiest things, and I think was probably one of the biggest surprises for everybody on the panel. The remarkable consistency in terms of the general themes of feedback, both at the roundtable discussions and in every single one of the submissions. Another point was that high performance is a critical component within the context of Sport for Life and the whole long-term athlete development model. And in fact, probably a good portion of the first part of the discussion at the roundtables was, why focus on high performance? Obviously it's a continuum and you can't have one with the other. What we had to do was at least paint a framework to say, we knew that this would have been too big. And what we needed to do was focus on something we could get our arms around, to be as specific as possible. And that throughout the report, one of the fundamental assumptions was, premise for the development of sport in Canada is through our athlete development model. And the focus of what our discussions will be on the high performance portion of it. We also talked about the pathway and approach being different for both individual and team sports. And this came up time and time again, that we have a system within our Canadian sport funding, support, infrastructure, whereby it was suggested that it is more sensitive right now to a single sport versus the anomalies of team sport. And that it was critically important for us to understand sport was to look deeper into the nuances and anomalies of both team sport and individual sport. And that currently the infrastructure and systems we have right now are more responsive and reflective to a single sport system. Now, is this bad or good? No, it just means it misses a portion that we have to open up our thinking to audit everything we do in sport that includes both a responsiveness to individual and team sport. It was indicated that there are some great things going on in sport, but it was the fragmentation and the space in between that was causing the biggest challenge. So again, another theme that drew everybody together was the need to knit together and align, to both recognize the best practices and the pockets of good and brilliant work that were going on, but to better align and knit them together. So there was less duplication, there was more alignment and feed-through and cross-referencing across the system. And then the last point I think I started with was just the incredible sense of commitment, leadership, and passion to work together to make it work. Now for myself, again, I was both honored and humbled to be on the panel and to be in that position to hear the amount of energy to create and shape the future of sport in Canada, and most notably the representation from many of you in the room at those panels. The vision relative to the report, and again, what's the definition of high performance sport? What's the vision? What we tried to do was to look at a statement that best reflected where people wanted to focus. We were trying to stay away from some of the wordsmithing because we knew that was going to be in the stages to come afterwards. So for the purposes of the discussion, we started off, whether it be the roundtables or the discussions, with the vision being that Canada would be the best in the world at the sports in which it competes. In terms of some of the key recommendations, of which there are many, and again, I point to both the gentleman behind me, Victor, and the very talented David Brooks, who distilled the many, many hours of discussion and ideas, both in the papers and the presentations. So I'm going to highlight a few of them. One of the most predominant recommendations was the appointment of an independent agency. And I want you to see through this, and particularly I hope this comes up in the questions. I want you to pay attention to both the structural, but also the essence under the structure. What are the guiding principles under this agency? What is the functionality? So we don't polarize the conversation to say agency or not, but more importantly, understand the guiding principles that this agency is responsible for. So there was a great appeal for a one window, a hub. The commentary clearly was, there are so many pieces, it's hard to understand, let alone navigate, let alone manage. Can we create a one window approach that makes our life as athletes, sport administrators, coaches, parents, easier? Also, we talked about a service provider that, again, several agencies were used as examples that providing direct technical support and appropriate technical support, again, to athletes, coaches, or sport administrators or leaders was absolutely a key requirement. I talked about the high performance focus, and again, for the purposes of the discussion, we agreed that the two focus areas of the LTAD, which were train to train and train to win, would be the focus of the discussion, at least to give all of us a similar reference point. As you'll see in a minute, what we did was talk about what the functionality, plus also what about 10, 12 attributes of this agency would be. Last but not least, because of both the timing, but also there was a recognition for many of the major games held in Canada, a theme throughout the whole discussions was Canada's a very rich country. In terms of its sport development, at the time we were looking forward to hosting one of the greatest events out in Vancouver. And what we wanted to do was talk about, can we both recognize and identify some of those key and rich attributes of VANOC and be able to both capitalize and provide a knowledge transfer of what VANOC has developed back into our sports system. Other attributes of the independent agency is that it was incorporated and independent governance. Now, if you have the opportunity to read the report, this was a key area in that the whole definition of serving public interest and what independence and test of independence is. Underlying these comments were things like an agency has to be nimble, an agency has to be responsive. The agency has to be able to react and have the ability to be independent in its key decisions and crafting of strategy and priorities in order to move sport forward in Canada. We also talked about a solid funding commitment. It was clear that there had to be a long-term funding commitment, and as you'll see through some of the other attributes, so that for programs, coaches, athletes, if we were to develop a long-term strategy, you can align it with a long-term budget and funding sources. There was a strong comment about painting the picture of sport in Canada, and that the requirement being that we focus both on Olympic and non-Olympic sport. We also, I think I've already talked about migrating and preserving the VANOC resources. And the last point I'd like to talk about is a key element was a discussion around some of the key organizations within Canada and what did this mean. Again, I'm going to say I think the panel was really pleased at the way that conversation was held, because oftentimes it gets into more of a you've got more than I've got less, and that wasn't the sentiment of the discussion at all. Specific to Sport Canada, there are a number of recommendations that Sport Canada, in terms of servicing and supporting public interest, would look at other areas that had more to do with policy, public policy and strategy related to sport, perhaps some research and analysis relative to our sport at an international and domestic level, and a number of other areas of development that were more aligned with a government role rather than a technical sport role. And also to be able to work hand in glove with Sport Canada and other agencies like CPC, COC. So again, the systems were aligned and that the agencies and groups were working in their zone and leadership of best skill. When I talked before about some of the key attributes of the independent agency or what it would do, this is the listing at a very high level of what it was recommended that this independent hub, technically based, one-window agency would provide. At the top of the list is high-performance funding. Again, long-term view against rigorously developed performance strategies, and that there was the funding to help support these strategies. The second point is OTP processes and approach. And the intention behind this one was to recognize that there had been some very, very positive feedback on some of the leadership that OTP had provided leading up to VANOC. The nimble, technically based contribution to many of the sports, whereby there was a customized relationship with the sport supported with expert resource and funds. So the comment on this one was, can we keep and retain the best of what OTP has to offer, and can we even take the next step and enhance some of those attributes of OTP to make it even better? Support for coaching, and again, as I listed the attributes of Eric's references for your contribution, I think actually all of your key points are actually contained in here, and coaching was at the top of the list, recognizing how fundamental and critical it is to our sports system to not only help support our coaches, but again, a longer-term view for coaches so we can both retain coaches, help support the development and leadership and succession of the coaches for a Made in Canada solution. Competitions, I'm going to speak to that at two levels. Number one, to ensure that there's an aligned competition framework for each and every sport. And then also that the multi-sport games organizations like CPC, Canadian Olympic Committee, Commonwealth Games, Pan American Games, that single sport, team sports, that Canada starts to recognize the value of hosting, both not only the fielding of our teams abroad as critical to the development of our sports system, but also an aggressive hosting strategy so that Canada also, through both multi-sport and single sport games, can further develop an infrastructure. Supporting the Canadian Sport Institutes, again, it was mentioned earlier, recognizing that both with the centers listed below and also with the sport institutes, that they were a critical part of the network for our sport infrastructure. They needed to be supported, they needed to be recognized, and also embedded within our sport development system. Talent identification, not only that we can learn and help support talent identification of our athletes, but also that we can make appropriate investments to accelerate the development of those athletes that have been identified. It's one thing to identify talent, it's another thing to be able to invest in the talent so they can move on to the appropriate levels of competition and high performance that they do. I've already spoken about the Canadian Sport for Life and the LTAD model, and this again was a critical underpinning of the entire report and a fundamental premise of the linkage and alignment throughout, and such that as much as we'd be focusing on high performance, we also needed to say that this didn't mean it was exclusive, but that if we're focusing on high performance, the performance bar and norms established at those levels, because if that's what best looks like, that informs the rest of our model also, so that we can help shape throughout all the stages of the LTAD what superior high performance sport looks like in Canada. In terms of the sports science and innovation, market comment throughout, not only through our sports centers and universities, was that a gap in most sports that seemed to be the biggest gap, aside from the coaching and the funding, was the need to be able to have access to funds and expert resources to be able to respond to key questions in sport that were not being responded to. So, what are the key questions? How do we respond to some of these performance questions? How do we monitor it ongoing to help influence our whole high performance in a relative sport? Revenue generation, I'm going to speak to that relative to the VANOC piece. And again, revenue generation, sustainability, huge questions, identified a number of sources of revenue to be able to support the system as we see it for 2010 and beyond. But again, I'm going to go back to the VANOC example. We've hosted a number of major games in Canada whereby there's been an incredible body of knowledge, work, relationships formed around certain properties. And with the Pan Ams coming up and with many of the other single sport hosting, these are huge. And what we want to do is figure out a better way to retain the knowledge, the relationships, and the funding into a high performance pot so it just does not become a discrete performance event ends, and then all of that institutional knowledge is lost. And last but not least, the partnership building, and I spoke to that at the beginning, whereby it wasn't that people thought that things were terrifically broken, but it was felt that we still can do better by recognizing the gap in between and working to align and connect and help support. So absolutely critical that as individuals, as communities, as organizations, as sports centers, that we better align and work together. I put this one, I only had about 4.5 minutes, that's why I don't want to look back here. I think I'm about I wanted to finish with this slide, and this is the final word. I'm going to read this out. We applaud this opportunity to come together as a sector and look to build on the collective strength of the sport community 2010 and beyond. Athletes and coaches recognize the positive impact the sport plays within the greater social context of our society and strive to promote sport as a key Canadian public asset. Strategic leadership and governance will facilitate high-performance results and synergies throughout the system and across sectors such as healthcare, justice, and education. We look forward to the opportunity to further collaborate, build on the successes, and establish a direction for the future of sport in Canada. For me, leadership is always about right person, right time, right opportunity. This is the last paragraph actually from your submission, the submission that you co-authored with the coaches group. And I was really struck by this because this both, for me, reminds me of the sentiment that we saw so well displayed throughout the discussions and the dialogue. But more importantly, this spoke to me well beyond the panel. And it spoke to me about the kind of leadership that this group, both as an individual and a group, were prepared to step up to help shape the future of sport in Canada. So from a panel member perspective, but also as a person who's keenly interested in helping to shape the future of sport in Canada, I'd encourage you to reread this. But also, please don't ever lose that sense of spirit and passion that certainly I was exposed to during the panel, and for me is best illustrated in your closing comment for your submission. Thank you.
Good morning, bonjour tout le monde. Thanks very much, Karen. That was great, and I now have half the time, so I'm really happy about that too. So, I'd like to just pick up on the final words that Karen brought to your attention, and just acknowledge that sport is one of our greatest public assets, and that's what we learned out of Vancouver. The success at the Games really brought home to all of us who do work day in and day out in sport that Canadians care about how our athletes perform. And, you know, it's an exciting thing that drives us to work every day to know that with each and every great performance that we have from Canadian high-performance athletes, it matters in Canadian households. So that was one very powerful output from the Games. It also, the Games changed our nation, and we've heard that many times from John Furlong and his colleagues and all of the athletes and coaches that were competing in Vancouver. It really did have an impact on our country, and it's a tremendous momentum builder for us as we move forward into London and Sochi. I'd like to just give you a very high-level overview about On the Podium, and I think what's going to be more valuable is some of the questions that you'll pose after this brief overview. So let me get into this. So first of all, our philosophy is one that is athlete-focused, coach-led, service-enhanced. And when we talk about service, we're talking about the kind of sport medicine, sports science services that many athletes in their daily training environment and daily competition environment have the opportunity to access. And finally, performance-driven. We do very much focus on results, and you'll see that if you aren't already aware of what On the Podium is all about. Our vision is for Canada to be a world leader in high-performance sport. We would like to literally own the podium, and that's going to take some time for that to happen, but that's our vision down the road, is to be a world leader, not just once, but a sustained world leader. And our mission is to lead the development of Canadian sports to achieve sustainable podium results at the Olympic and Paralympic Games. So not just a one-shot effort, it's about sustaining results longer term through 2020 and beyond. As Eric mentioned, I work in the summer portfolio. My colleague Ken Reid is the director of winter sport. So I'm much more familiar with the summer sport ins and outs than winter. So just on the heels of Vancouver, the winter kind of technical department, in collaboration with the Canadian Olympic Committee, Canadian Paralympic Committee, and the national sport organizations, are now determining what the performance goals are for Sochi and 2018. So that will be forthcoming. On the summer side, these have been public for quite some time now. Our goal is to place in the top 12 nations in medal count in London and the top 8 nations in the gold medal count in the Paralympic Games. And as many of you would know, the International Paralympic Committee determines the overall world ranking based on gold medal count as opposed to total medal count. So that's why there's a difference between the Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games performance goals. The team sport performance goals will follow, and Karen mentioned one of the big statements coming out of the 2010 and Beyond panel is recognition that we need to consider the investment in individual sports versus team sports differently. Last week we hosted the first ever Summer Team Sports Summit. We had 190 people from all of the Summer Olympic and Paralympic team sports present. We also had non-Olympic team sports present, and the goal was to identify some of the systemic barriers that our summer team sports have in front of them and to determine strategies and solutions that will guide them going forward. We know that on the team sport front, we aren't going to be successful in 2012 beyond the ones we've are already providing financial recommendations to. It'll take 2020 and beyond before we really see a systemic difference in the performance of our summer Olympic and Paralympic team sports. And our ultimate goal for On the Podium is to be a top 6 nation at the Olympics and Paralympic Games. And we're not at the point yet where we're able to say when that will be, but we feel that post-London we should have a better feel for what's the time, what's a reasonable time to be shooting for that. It's not just about performance goals at the immediate or upcoming Olympic and Paralympic Games. We know that in order for us to be successful in sustaining that performance, we need to build the system. And so we do believe we are the leaders in partnering with all the various players that are involved in sport, and it's pretty complicated, as Karen mentioned, but we have a key role to play in that overall system development. So how do we do this? One misconception is that OTP writes checks to national sport organizations and individual athletes. Well, we don't. We make funding recommendations, and 96% of our funding comes from the Government of Canada, from Sport Canada. And that funding has increased dramatically over the last 10 years. And that's through the political will and support of one minister that we have right now, and he's a tremendous asset for the Canadian sport community, and that's Gary Lunn. And Gary is one of our champions and a very, very good one. And so through Gary's efforts, we've been able to increase the amount of public support that is available, particularly for high-performance sport. So we don't write checks, we make funding recommendations, and we make those funding recommendations based on an approach that looks at medal potential as the primary consideration. We use a top-down approach to target and prioritize those funding recommendations. And whereas in the past it might have been based on past results, it's not based on that anymore. It's not a reward for past results. Those funding recommendations are based on future medal possibility. Now, granted, we can't assess future medal possibility without looking at how a sport has performed in the past, but they aren't the only consideration. And our technical liaison with each of the sport organizations really looks at what athlete pool is in the system right now, how close are they to the world leaders, and what are the gaps? How do we get those athletes that are in the pool right now to narrow the gap between the world leaders? So it is very much about looking, where are we now, where do we want to be, and how are we going to close the gap? And what resources are required to close that gap? A little bit of kind of more technical content, and I think this is helpful to understand the number of sports that we do provide funding recommendations for, and also the individual athlete program. So within both summer and winter, we categorize sports into 3 areas. The first one is Category 1, and for both summer and winter, Category 1 are those sports that have a high probability of winning more than one medal, so multiple medal-winning sports. And examples of those are canoeing, rowing, diving, trampoline, women's wrestling. So those are all on the summer side sports that are currently Category 1. And so that's the highest ranking of sport within On the Podium's framework. And they're the ones that, we try to provide recommendations that will not just support them through the next Olympic Games, but the one after that. Because we need those sports to sustain their performance. Category 2 is the second ranking, and that's a high probability of a single medal performance in the upcoming Olympic Games. And same with as with Category 1, we also look at a longer term investment with those sports. So Category 1s and 2s, we would be looking at kind of the junior national team level. What's the pool going forward beyond the next Olympic Games? And they're different than Category 3s. Category 3s, we're only focusing on the next Olympic Games. So those are sports that have a high probability of multiple top 8s and a moderate probability for a single medal. So that's our highest risk investment. Those are the ones, well, you know, there's a good pool of top 8 athletes, and if things, if things are in good shape going into the upcoming games, then we feel comfortable that there's the potential return of one medal. Those aren't sports that have repeatedly won medals at the Olympic Games. And just one other thing on Category 3s, again, we don't invest beyond the upcoming games. So Category 1s and 2s, it's a much deeper investment, and Category 3s is only the upcoming games. And that's the same with Paralympic sports. It's exactly the same process. We also have, hang on, I've got to go back here. We also have an individual athlete support program, and we recognize that not all national sport organizations have the quality of a high-performance program that's going to generate medals all the time. And we want to make sure that we don't forget about those individual athletes that have proven performance or have the potential to perform going forward. So we have an individual athlete support initiative where athletes that are ranked in the current World Championships as being in the top 4 in an Olympic event or top 3 in a Paralympic event, we will work with those athletes and their personal coaches or national team coaches to provide individual support. That's on there's an application process, and I can certainly follow up with any of you if you're not aware of that program and you think athletes in your sport that currently aren't being ranked by Own the Podium, we need to make sure that we capture those athletes going forward. And what are the investment priorities? Karen mentioned that coaching and technical leadership was one of the key outcomes or gaps in the analysis of the 2010 and beyond panel. We still need to invest in coaching and technical leadership. That is our #1 priority. There's been significant improvements, but we're not there yet. So the sports that we're currently supporting, there are many great coaches involved. It's not good enough to just have coaches that are going to see us through to the next games. We need to have the next generation of coaches. So succession planning around coaches is another critical element that we support. Training and competition, that's what makes the difference in the lives of athletes day in and day out. Making sure that the daily training environment for the targeted podium potential athletes and their coaches is world leading. And those are the top 2. Those are the basics. If we don't have those 2 looked after, then all the rest of the stuff is fluff. So those are the first 2. Once we get past that, we look at the quality support service. So do we have the kind of strength and conditioning program, massage services, athletic therapy, all the what we call, and many of you would know about the integrated support teams that would be providing athletes both in the training environment and in the competition environment. Performance technology. Are we sure that the technical competencies of athletes are world leading? So those are all the kind of quality support services that we support. And many of those are done through the Canadian Sports Centres, and they too are evolving to an institute type approach. And finally, program administration, and that is focused at the National Sport Organization itself. And I just thought I'd, in case you didn't know, give you a quick overview of the sports that are supported right now, and these are summer sports. So Category 1, 2, and 3, you can see them up there. We don't support necessarily the organization as a whole, so we wouldn't support, for example, we may not support, for example, men's soccer and women's soccer. Those are distinct sports in our view, and so we look at the potential for the women's soccer team to medal in 2012 and beyond, as opposed to supporting the entire organization. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see currently we're supporting individual athletes in weightlifting, boxing, and taekwondo. And the Paralympic sports, you can see category 1, 2, and 3. And we know that our success in London is linked very closely to the success in swimming and athletics. They have the lion's share of available gold medals in the Paralympic movement. So certainly those have been two sports that have been tremendously successful for Canada. And we're hopeful that pressure's on for swimming and athletics going into London.
You have a question,
Yeah.
Aaron?
Yes?
Find a microphone first, or we'll get Justin. Hugh McDonald, Archery. Are these lists exhaustives, or are they just samples?
Well, these are currently the sports that are supported through on the Podium summer program. We're entering the mid-quad review right now. The review periods with each of the sports that are on the Olympic and Paralympic slides. We will go through an analysis of their program right now at the mid-quad point. We're less than 16 months out of London. And at this point, it's an opportunity for us to have considered new sports that are well positioned going into London 2012 that aren't currently being recommended for funding, and to also look at the category 3 sports and say, well, which ones aren't performing? Category 1s and 2s, they're secure going into London. Category 3s are on the bubble. So that's our opportunity to really look at who have we missed and consider additions, and also to look at those who are there right now and who's not on track for London. So it's a very important upcoming mid-quad review. And I pulled off the winter sports as well, and they've just finished their review period. And so they're there for your information. And I'll make sure with Ashley that you have a copy of this in case you want to refer to it after. And those are category 3s, and three unique projects that the winter program has just initiated with ski cross alpine, women's ski jumping, because it's not currently on the Olympic program, and we want to make sure that as a nation we're not behind the 8 ball with women's ski jumping, and the Nordic sports. And the winter Paralympic sports. And just wanted to finish with one closing thought. You probably, you may have heard this before, but Michelangelo said the greatest danger for most of us is not that our aim is too high and we miss it, but that it is too low and we reach it. Okay, I'm done. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you, Anne. So we already had one question. Are there any questions to the panelists just in terms of what you heard, some specific stuff, and then we can get into some good discussion. So you can use, you can go ahead and use the mic, and I think you were first.
Louis Poirier, bobsleigh. I believe there was an announcement this week about some new funding for team sports. Is anyone able to talk to that?
Sure, I can. As I mentioned last week, we had a summer team sports summit, and in the 2010-11 budget, Gary Lunn was successful in obtaining $6 million a year for the next 5 years, and those funds are exclusively for summer team sports. So one of the purposes of the summit is to identify what's the best areas for investment for those summer team sport funds. So we will go through a similar process in collaboration with Sport Canada in reviewing the Summer Olympic and Paralympic team sports that aren't currently targeted, and determine those that are, the most well positioned. What are the best investments for our public monies in terms of having sustained podium results in team sports? We know, though, that it's not going to be until 2020 that we really see the impact of those results. As we've mentioned a couple times, the nature of the investment for team sports is quite different than individual sports. The systemic barriers are significant, and so we need to have a different approach for team sports, both in terms of developing the pool of athletes and addressing some of the tougher challenges that are unique to team sports as compared to individual sports.
Brian Johns from Swimming. I have a question for Karen, especially about the proposed independent agency. It's obvious that there's a lot of people who are involved with sport in Canada are extremely passionate, but I've always felt like that the our hard work is kind of pulled in a lot of different directions, and obviously this is an idea to kind of bring it all together. And I was wondering, is this going to be an agency that's going to be a new organization in which these goals are going to be approached, or is it going to be more of a bringing together of the organizations that we currently have now and being able to use those resources that we and people who are already in place and just being able to streamline it into a new direction?
I think I like Anne's question better about the available funding. Good question. I've got a position at such that the minister asked us to provide the panel report, and the recommendations rest with the minister, but I can speak to his response post facto on that one. I'm going to go to the latter part of your comment, because I think certainly the minister's response is to better utilize the current resources, the organizations, and align with what's in our system right now. That's the first part. But he's also taken some steps to be able to look at some enhancements. For instance, meeting with CPC, COC, Sport Canada, and the Podium to be able to look at some stronger collaboration and alignment. For instance, establishing a board and a chair for On the Podium with John Furlong as the chair for the board for On the Podium. So those are two examples of the minister taking elements of the report and following up on various aspects. I don't think the intention ever was to say, my gosh, things are terrifically broken, we need to blow up the system. Quite the opposite. It was to recognize, in fact, that was striking, how much was out there, how can we better self-organize, align, and utilize everybody's strengths. Last but not least, it was recognized in the report and throughout that, not unlike the investment in the sports that Anne was speaking about, this is going to take some time. So I think the minister is looking at this now as a document, as recommendations to help further support his vision and leadership moving forward. So those are examples of a couple of the immediate things that he's already done with the report.
I might add a comment, since I participated in the panel, because the interesting thing is a lot of the stuff we heard wasn't just about the government. It was about ourselves. A lot of things that we can do ourselves. And so if ever you read the report, you'll see in there that there are people who said, well, we could improve the institutes. We don't need the government to do that. We could improve ways that we plan. We don't need the government to do that. We can form alliances and tackle problems. So a lot of it, I think, gave us a sense of an ability to work together to solve a lot of the problems. Now, we're going to have a certain limited amount of time, so if you have any questions, it's time, and I can even hand you this, save you some time, go.
Hi, Jeff Payne, ex-skeleton athlete. OTP's been very good at becoming a supplier of what I call the stuff. All the things we need, the technology, the added coaches, all the stuff. What role is OTP taking, if any, in the support of athletes outside of the realm of sport, i.e. Helping us fund our lives so that we can actually apply ourselves to sport?
Not much.
I think, it's really not current. We certainly, it's been identified as a gap in the system, and the question is what organizations are the best suited to address post-athletic life. On the Podium's mandate is very, very focused. It is about getting athletes on the podium in the Olympic and Paralympic Games. It hasn't been suggested to this point that our mandate should be expanded to facilitate the transition of athletes post-high performance career into whatever area to facilitate that transition. That's not to say that it isn't. I just want to acknowledge that it is a gap, and I think there are many organizations, and Athletes Can is one that's doing a great job in terms of increasing the awareness of that gap and developing strategies to improve the services that are available. The Canadian Sports Centres are another network of organizations that have that at the top of their list in terms of services that are essential for athletes post-career. Right now, it hasn't really been on our radar.
To follow up on that, I wasn't really necessarily speaking of post-career. While that is a huge gap, I think I'm actually talking in the career. It's my opinion that if we want to have athletes perform better, we need to take care of them and support their lives and livelihoods while they're doing sport. Because if I can't pay my mortgage, I'm not going to compete as well on the day because I have other things on my mind. And if the difference between a gold medal and 10th place is a tenth of 1%, well, that financial concern I have is going to affect my performance. So.
Well, certainly for the podium potential athletes, that there's an opportunity through the review process and our dialogue with each of those national sport organizations to identify the needs of individual athletes as they prepare for the games. So it may not be that we're paying mortgages for athletes, but we will certainly work with the national sport organizations in identifying what other financial pressures could we relieve so that an athlete has enough money to prepare unencumbered from those stresses going into an Olympic and Paralympic Games. I know Bob Price is at the back of the room, and Bob's the director of the Athlete Assistance Program with Sport Canada, and there's some very, very positive changes being considered through the AAP program, and one of those addresses your question exactly, Jeff, around the particular needs, either from providing care for family or excellence-related needs. So there's more opportunity coming down the pipe, I think, in terms of making sure that we address the needs of individual athletes going into games.
And if anybody has any comments to answer Jeff on ideas on how to provide that kind of support, share your ideas amongst yourselves. So we're going to have to move quickly. Lots of people have questions, so short questions and short answers.
Hi, Tom Hall, Canoe Kayak. Hi, Anne. This one's for you. You mentioned that On the Podium doesn't look back or too much. I mean, you have to take in past performances as part of your evaluation of whether or not a sport's going to get funded in what category. And then you go on to say that athletes who achieve a top 4 or top 3 performance can get further access to funding, which is kind of a retroactive funding scheme, I guess. But what that makes me think of, if you're funding someone who's 4th place in the World Championships or something like that, or 3rd or 1st, whatever it is, that means you're supporting an athlete that's already successful, and that maybe they don't necessarily need that support. Maybe they don't need more, or maybe they need a little bit more to get there. But I think what I'm alluding to is whether or not it's been proven that targeting successful athletes in successful sports with more funding and equipment or whatever it is, does it work? Does it win more medals? Vancouver is a tough one because of it being in Vancouver in Canada, and I think there's a lot of reasons why we did so well there. Is there actual evidence that this method works and that it's effective? Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. That's a nice one. There is evidence, and despite the fact that it was a home games, the analysis, the evaluation of On the Podium's investment in Vancouver, Whistler, indicated that we did indeed have a difference. And we've done a post-games evaluation, and it's quite technical and can share many examples of where it did in fact make a difference. There is a contradiction between how an individual athlete would qualify for support versus the approach that's being taken from the sport as a whole. And the overall sport approach is very much based on a planning approach. So what is the plan? What is the high-performance plan for the organization going forward? So there they need to demonstrate how far they are from relative to the rest of the world, and what are the indicators for them as an organization to be successful longer term. We recognize, though, that not every national sport organization has the capacity to develop and implement a successful plan. So that's a reality. There's some national sport organizations that don't have the readiness, they don't have the capacity to be able to do that. It may not be their primary area of focus. And that's okay, but those aren't organizations that we're going to invest in because they can't prove that they can sustain that. That said, there's a whole group of potential individual athletes that, through their own means, we need to make sure that they have everything they need to perform. Those aren't significant investments. I've been there a year now, and the greatest investment that we've been able to make for a year-long program is $50,000. Sounds like a lot of money for an individual athlete, but having been competitive athletes yourself, depending on the sport that you're involved in, $50,000 for training, competition, equipment, etc., coaching can go pretty fast.
Here, did you want to? There you go. Got you.
Well, can I talk without the mic?
Yeah.
All right, I'm able to bellow. Oh, okay. Oh, sorry.
Here, I'll hold it over here.
Oh, sorry. Well, I was going to speak a little bit with what Tom just said in terms of how do you evaluate the success of On the Podium. And you kind of touched on it. Just one comment to what you're saying is just because an NSO might say that they're, okay, we're in Beijing and we'll get 2 medals, but we got 1 medal or something in that. I think what's a more interesting question to ask is the athletes that they said would do the performance. How do those measure up to the athletes that actually do it? And I'm from athletics, so I think of in Beijing, in that case, we had an athlete who medaled, who wasn't one of the targeted athletes from the inner circle. So how is that evaluated from? But my question that I have, my other question is more in terms of sustainability. It seems like this approach speaks to the Matthews effect. So those who have, more shall be given. So how do you account for NSO or a sport organization that is on the verge, isn't there yet, but because of the mandate that you guys have, they'll essentially be weeded out. And as well as the programs that are currently successful, how do you evaluate their sustainability in terms of like grassroots and those that are coming up to replace those athletes that will soon retire?
Let me comment for a second and to remind people that the panelists themselves are not decision makers, and so they can't actually tell you what changes or policies that can be made. They can inform you about how the system works, and I think therefore they're going to be helpful. But you really want to also think amongst yourselves, and when you hear these kind of questions, if you have ideas, in fact, in response to these kind of questions, because they're very good questions, that helps to inform everybody else in the room about ways of addressing some of the individual athlete concerns. The issue of targeting is obviously one that's important, and this is what you're talking about as well, and that those are going to stay there. If we do run out of time, I also want to remind everybody that I think Athletes Canada will make available an opportunity for you to record your questions. We'll get them into the system, and we'll get some answers back to you, I think. I think that's doable, because we will eventually run out of time. I think people are probably hungry. I think lunch is getting ready. Right. So, quick response to... I don't know your name, but the tall woman's question.
Thanks, Nicole. Good question. What the NSO says isn't gospel. So we have technical experts within On the Podium that analyze where the sport is, where the rest of the world is, the athletes that have been identified, and benchmarks are established, both training and competition benchmarks that are assessed as throughout the quadrennial. So it is quite objective in terms of our liaison with those national sport organizations. On the summer side, On the Podium just initially got into play on the summer side in Beijing. So I think it's fair to say that we really won't see the potential impact of our investment on sports until London as far as the summer games are concerned. Just trying to think, there was one more at the end. Sustainability. So there again, when the organizations develop their high performance plans, so it isn't about them coming in and pitching an initiative or proposing an initiative to us. It's about them coming in with a business case, a well thought out, researched high performance plan that, of course, some of it's going to be based on how successful they've been in implementing that to date, but so that is a piece of it, and that is the piece about looking back to see how well they've performed to date, just like you would as if you're an investor in a particular company and you wanted to see what their performance was on the stock market or whatever going forward. So that is a piece of it, but there's more about their analysis of their place in the high performance arena, and you look at athlete pool, you look at technical leadership, the quality of the coaches that they have. You look at what gaps that are easily filled within our resource base, and there's an assessment made, a technical assessment made on whether they have the potential to perform, in our opinion. So it's not, you know, what the NSO says is gospel. We kind of know that if an NSO comes in and says, well, we've got 4 medal potential athletes, you know, if we're doing a reasonable job, you might deliver on 50% of those. Right? So that's kind of the, you know, we know that the conversion rate is a good conversion rate in terms of if you're top 5 or top 6 going into the Olympics and Paralympic Games, then you have about a 50%, if you're doing a good job, you've got a 50% conversion rate. And there's data across the world that substantiates that. Canada's conversion rate used to be, pre-Own the Podium, was about 24-25%. I mean, I can get you the data for Whistler, but Vancouver Whistler, but it increased significantly. And that's a key statistic that we look at in terms of trying to figure out if we're having an impact on that or not. Just one last comment on this, and there's a finite pot of money, right? So, you know, there's a pot of money, and we in Canada have in the past been really good at spreading that a mile wide and an inch deep. And we weren't having the kind of success that we wanted. So Own the Podium brought a different approach to our investment in high-performance sport. And it's a very targeted, focused approach. It's not about you're an Olympic or Paralympic sport, and because of that, you're going to have the same cut of the pie as everyone else. So, you know, we don't make any apologies for that. It is a very targeted, focused approach, and one that the data has shown has been successful. We've heard that there are, beyond the financial investments, there are other things that we as technical leaders at Own the Podium can share with the non-targeted sports to make sure that our overall level of high-performance sport in Canada increases. Because we're not going to get better and reach our end goal of being top 6 at the Summer Olympic Games if we don't have every Summer Olympic sport performing better than they are right now. So that's just come out in the last kind of 2 months, and so the difficulty we have within our organization is that there's a limit to the capacity that we have. So, you know, it's a small shop, and so if we're going to now look at the needs of the non-targeted sports, it really stretches our capacity, and we don't want to take our eye off the ball of those sports that are currently performing.
All right, so Nathaniel has a question, and then I think we'll have at least.
That's going to happen. The lunch is
Getting cold.
Okay. That can be the last question, but
Well, this fellow's been aching. Maybe we'll get 2 questions out at the same time. What's yours?
Hi, Nathaniel Miller, water polo. So my question, it was kind of a follow-up a little bit to what Thomas was speaking to, but you mentioned the individual athlete support in sports that aren't necessarily recognized or targeted when there's a single case of an athlete who has that potential, supporting them. Well, in the team sport world, obviously that's a harder distinction to make, and I didn't hear anything speaking to that, but I know from my personal experience in our program over my 12-year career, there's been single athletes who did get to a level amongst the top 4 in the world or the top 8 in the world, but then subsequently ended up retiring well before they were able to help the rest of the team get up to that level because they had no access to any support or additional funding on the individual level because they're part of a team sport. So I'm wondering if that aspect is being considered or addressed at all in the team sport world, where you can have individuals who are world-class performers at the highest level, at the podium level, but in the team sport environment, as you acknowledge, our team sport system is broken, and we haven't had a medal in a true team sport since I think it was 1968, I believe. So is there anything to address that area?
So as you think about that, I'll just check to see here, just to know what, briefly, Brian. Briefly.
Yeah, I'll pose it as a comment or a suggestion to save you from answering. So it's about social responsibility, and I'm wondering if OTP has a targeted approach to social responsibility, and I mean specifically leveraging the athletes and engaging the athletes the way that the Esteem team does, or the way that Kids Sport does, or the way that the school visit that Athletes Canada does, so that the optics to society, to taxpayers, when you talk about a finite pot of money, if you ask people in my neighborhood or friends and they say, right after 2010, was all that money towards the athletes, is it worth it? Yeah, they were a shining beacon for us, but you asked them in 2011, I don't feel it anymore. But if you're engaging the athletes in the community, then I think the answer is more likely to be yes. And I do have very specific examples and concepts of ideas of how we can do that. I won't go into them, but I'd be happy to discuss those with you.
So I think we have an idea of athletes giving back and the system supporting athletes who want to be able to give back to their sport, to others, and to community.
I can be fast.
You can be fast. You're going to have to be fast.
I'll be
or
really fast.
I'm going to sick Lori on you.
Okay. So team sports, no, we haven't looked at individual athletes within a team sport because a team sport success is based on the overall performance of the entire team. So that's a struggle for us. To the question of athletes, social responsibility around athletes, the independent agency that was recommended out of the panel would be one that would involve the whole public relations, was one that would be suggested to involve the whole public relations, communications, marketing portfolio. Right now, that's not within On the Podium's mandate. That is within the major games organizations in Canada. So the Canadian Olympic Committee, Canadian Paralympic Committee. We're keen to do that, but it's not in our mandate is very clear from the minister. So we recognize, though, that that's a critical need, and we can only hope that individual national sport organizations and multi-sport organizations like COC and CPC can continue to be successful in that regard. And the True Sport Foundation, and it was 1936 was our last summer Olympic silver medal from basketball in traditional summer team sports.
Juste un petit mot ici de Caroline Ouellette.
I'm Caroline Ouellette with hockey. I just wanted to say that I know On the Podium helps our team, but I have no idea in what ways. Absolutely none. And you were talking about the national sports organization, so Hockey Canada, for us, setting up the needs. And I feel like we have no input in what those needs are. And for them, I don't know what they tell you they are, but I'm sure they are based on Olympic year training. But for us, the real challenge is on non-Olympic years, those 3 years where we prepare for that Olympic year. And that's when we would need a lot of support, a lot of money for that when we train in Montreal or in the cities where we're from. So I don't know if there's a way to tell the athlete reps in every sports how much is invested in our sports and where it's going.
So go ahead.
On our website is the year-by-year investment, and it goes directly to the National Sport Organization. It supports individual athlete needs, training and competition, IST support, and coaches.
But who determines the individual athlete needs?
Your NSO.
So it sounds like there's a couple of good takeaways here, a good opportunity for potentially strong communication and feedback between the athletes and the NSOs, which is one of the things that we're discussing here strongly. And I think for On the Podium to hear that, that maybe that feedback isn't being integrated into the process is potentially an opportunity to review the requirements of that process in that feedback. Maybe is a good opportunity to identify gaps to continue to push forward towards a common objective. This has been very, very insightful, and there's a lot of information. We could spend an entire weekend just on this one topic, I believe. The way that we do have this structured, Lane McAdam, Executive Director of Sport Excellence from Sport Canada, will be speaking this afternoon, and there will be an opportunity to discuss how On the Podium and Sport Canada, how those organizations are interacting, what their specific roles are within the sport environment, and how the recommendations of the 2010 Beyond panel, how those are being carried forward. So a lot of the questions that I think we have from this, we can also pose and frame how that interacts, and we can go over those with Liam McAdam. I would like to thank you all very much for your time, and look forward to the chance to follow up with you again.